Welcome here to our next session of the Mars webinar. Tonight it's different. Hey, it's Wednesday, it's 6 o'clock. Yeah. And we're sitting actually next together. It's first time since we started the webinar. Thanks to the hotel here in Zurich. Happy to be here fully vaccinated. So it's also not a problem to keep less distance, right? And if you don't get your COVID vaccination shot, so please get it. So it's really a good thing. And even there are some side effects, getting sick is actually a much bigger side effect, right? So it's totally worthless to get vaccinated. Okay, so tonight we have our webinar about the topics market access and reimbursement. My name is Lutz Wurmer, and I will be your moderator tonight. So just before we come to our topic about the experimental coverage in Germany, I just want to point out, did you hear from our MAP market access podcast, already? MAP is the bi-weekly market access podcast also provided by us, by the Mars Market Access and Pricing Strategy. And check out our last episode, which is already available on all available platforms here for the podcast, on iOS, on Spotify, on Android, right? With our good friend, Dr. Anne-Sophie Geyer from the Head Association Digital Healthcare, and from our good friend, Professor Dr. David Matasiewicz, 1 year DIGA in the fast track process for digital health applications successful. So please check it out. That's a good thing. Also, the next one is actually a really nice topic with our good friend Bibiane Schulte-Bosse, right?
Yes, absolutely. How to fight best in negotiations within the AMNOG process. So
okay,
check it out. It will go live November 1st.
Also a really nice topic. And then also let's point out a little bit about us, the Market Access and Pricing Strategy. We are the German-speaking market access experts for Austria, Switzerland, and Germany. We have a nice portfolio of all what you need about that topic. So we make price and reimbursement strategies. We do all the reimbursement submissions and also discussion and advice for the Federal Joint Committee in Germany, with the BfArM about the digital health application process, with the Swiss Bundesamt für Gesundheit head association, also with the Austrian Hauptverband. So if you need their advice or help with your dossiers and stuff, feel free to contact us anytime. Also, we do all the health economics calculations if you need that. And of course, if we're talking about health, that is a regulated market where there are actually price negotiations. And so we support you with the tactics also, and how to set up the price actually. And then here also with our virtual reality bootcamp, where we actually try to give you just a better preparation for a successful price negotiation for both for the authorities and also for you as a company.
That's also why we were here today, Lutz, right?
Exactly, yeah. So, I mean, it's not always like a fight. It's also something like finding together best way and actually understand the need of each other, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. And if you did not register yet for our next webinar, which is about the regional drug budgets and the KV as the hidden watchdog in Germany, where we have Dr. Matthias Flume actually as the watchdog. I don't know. Let's discuss with him and check out. It's not the last Thursday in November. It's on November 18th because of Thanksgiving. So guys, for you in the US, we moved it for you. So you don't have to sit on Thanksgiving here to watch our webinar. Okay, as always, feel free to ask questions after the presentation. We will have time for your questions. Use either the Zoom chat function or the Q&A function here to raise your questions and comments. And as always, the slides will be provided afterwards, and the video is published on our YouTube channel, actually on our website, which brings us to the next slide here. Check out our website, www.marketaccess-pricingstrategy.de. And there you find the button for the webinars. Okay, and now our presenters and discussants today. My good friend and boss, Dr. Stefan Walzer, actually, former employee of Roche, and also a lecturer at the University of Applied Sciences in Weingarten here in Germany in the health economics, and the founder of Mars on the one side. Hello, Stefan.
Hi, Lutz.
And on the other side, we are happy actually to have him tonight. From the Federal Joint Committee in Germany, Dr. Mathias Perleth. He's also a lecturer at the Technical University at Berlin. Good evening to Berlin, Dr. Perleth.
Hello all together.
Wonderful. So, Stefan, when I was prepared for that topic tonight, right? The good, the bad, the ugly. I have the question: if Mathias Perleth is actually the good one, and are you the bad one? And the most important question of tonight: am I the ugly one?
Of course, Lutz. No. I think the title is obviously, let's say, borrowed from the quite famous movie, the Western movie. I think, when was it, let's say, broadcast in the 50s or 60s? I think that is basically the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I think the core question is basically really, what if you're basically in a confrontation, and how to basically as well move that you get still the best out of it. And I think that was why we thought we maybe take this as a kind of theme for tonight.
Okay, and we have here a small clip together. You probably all remember that intensive music. Yeah, and in Germany, it's actually, the title is "Play Me the Song of the Deaf."
Yes,
Right.
exactly.
Yeah, is that something we have here tonight? I mean, with the experimental coverage, it's something, I have a really good product, but I have no data.
Yeah, it's exactly going into that direction, where this is your, let's say, death penalty. I hope not from an industry perspective, certainly also obviously not from the healthcare systems perspective, but let's just see. I think that is also one of the core parts and core points now for the next couple of minutes. First, I will introduce the components of, let's say, the market access in Germany, and then obviously we're looking forward to get the further insights from Mathias Perleth in terms of the experimental coverage. So thank you, Lutz, for the introduction. Thank you, Mathias Perleth, for joining us. Highly appreciate it. And now just start as well, let's say maybe a bit from the basics. So general hurdles for market access. Is it maybe hurdles? I don't know. But let's maybe say it's more the structural part, which is really important. Also keeping in mind when you maybe plan for your market access into Germany, having maybe tonight, it's the special focus obviously on medical devices. Keep in mind, we still have a bit more than 100 individual health insurance funds, the statutory health insurance funds, not the private ones. I think that's something keeping in mind also when you, let's say, start digging out what might be the best pathway to get your product onto the market. And the other point is quite clearly also here, we have big regionalization in the general kind of structure of the country, which is, we'll see that in a minute, may be important also when you plan your strategy. We have 17 associations of statutory health insurance physicians, basically the KVs, what Lutz has just mentioned a minute ago, and then those 16 regions I was already thinking. Also important is we have, I would say still, we see what will happen maybe after we might have a new government, a strict separation of the in and outpatient sector. So that's also something keeping in mind. If you have maybe a product, especially not only focusing on one of those settings, but maybe a product which has then as well a potential, let's say, good outcome in the in and the outpatient sector. And finally, not to forget, if you maybe go really into the inpatient setting, we have also a diverse hospital landscape with different kind of, let's call it owners, or let's say the institutions running the hospitals. We have private hospitals, we have big university hospitals, smaller hospitals, and also basically driving and driven by the different owners, as already said. So this is the kind of structure in the German, let's say, context. It's not getting easier, right? I think that's maybe the kind of, it's probably not the question of easiness, it's probably more the kind of complexity, I think. So if you think you have a product, it's very important to first of all check if it's in the inpatient or in the outpatient setting, or maybe even, let's say, serving both pathways, because this has obviously different implications. I think we have had already a good webinar, I think in spring this year, on the inpatient market access, which is obviously covering the DRGs, but especially obviously the NUP and the Zusatzentgelt discussion. And then where I think we want to focus today a bit more is on the outpatient setting. You see already different boxes here with different regulations. You see ASVRL, we'll not cover that today. We have selective contracts. You have at the bottom of it, you have the integrated care contract as a potential solution. This is especially maybe where you need to keep in mind those a bit more than 100 health insurances, and not the kind of, let's say, national, let's call it solution maybe. And that's also where, let's say, the kind of maybe confrontation is well in there. You see the EBM application. And I think where we want to focus today is on what you see in the middle of that. It's the application of the experimental coverage. What that really is, we'll learn and listen in a couple of minutes. But before that, I think it's also important, and that is obviously why we have Dr. Perleth today here from the GBA. The GBA is driven by evidence-based medicine. Not a surprise, not to me, not to Lutz, probably not to some of you now just watching and following us, but still to some people around the world also working in market access, right? So just have a look. We'll not go through the detail, but it's quite clear. Randomized controlled trials is the core basis, I think, for a high quality kind of evidence base, which is then also driving the, let's say, positive decision also from a GBA's perspective. But as Lutz already pointed out, what if you don't have that? What if you don't, let's say, either have that as an evidence base for your submission, or if you don't have maybe, let's say, a plan for that already? There are different pathways. I've just said, if it's in the outpatient setting, there might be as well the process of a methods assessment. This is one part. No worries, we'll not go into the details today, but more importantly, there's potentially also one of the outcomes. And I think, Dr. Perleth, you will also quickly touch base on that later on. And you see in that blue box where it just simply still says experimental coverage according to, and then we have the legal frame of that. So that is one of the pathways where, for example, the experimental coverage could kick in. Anyhow, even more important, I think, from my perspective, is also that the experimental coverage pathway could also be initiated by the industry. So there's a template, and the template could be basically then filed with the GBA. And I think that's also something which we'll hear in a bit also from Dr. Perleth with a different kind of details. So how many of those experimental studies are currently running? Let's just see. We have 7 currently in there, with 26 procedures currently being done between 2016 and now towards the end of Q3 2021. So it's also a bit of the question, obviously, is that now really a good, let's say, good and potential pathway moving forward? It's maybe too complicated, but I think to know that, I think it's probably best to directly hand over to the one who I think should also know it. And I think as Lutz already, let's say, quickly introduced, I think it's a great pleasure to have you, Dr. Mathias Perleth, today in here. I mean, he's the head of the Department of Medical Advisory Service at the GBA. And having said that, I would hand over to you, Dr. Perleth.
Thank you very much, and welcome to this webinar, everybody. So I'm head of the Department of Medical Consultancy within the Office of the Federal Joint Committee in Germany since 2007, and as you can see, I'm in the field of health technology assessment since many years. Before that, I was working at one of the major health insurance funds in Germany for a couple of years, and before that I was at the Hanover Medical School, and where I also got my PhD. So my responsibility, or our responsibility of my department in the Federal Joint Committee is in general give advice to all our committees which deal with many different technologies, including drugs. We are also responsible for orphan drug assessment, and but also for advising the committees, our committees and manufacturers on medical device-related procedures, what we call methods. I will come back to that later. And this is what I will talk about today. So next one, please. Yes, shortly as a background, the GBA is the main decision-making body in German healthcare. It is responsible for statutory health insurance, which covers in Germany about 90% of the population. GBA is legally mandated to issue legally binding directives that regulate large parts of the benefit package. And it is a stakeholder organization comprised by physicians, hospitals, sickness funds, and patient representatives, and led by impartial members. One of those is the chair, and it is legally supervised by the Ministry of Health. And on the next slide, you will see our responsibilities and our scope of work, which relates to ambulatory care, to hospital care, to dental care, and to psychotherapy. And we issue directives in the fields of quality assurance, pharmaceuticals, especially the famous AMNOG, but also other areas, including vaccinations. We issue directives on other areas like planning of the numbers of doctors in outpatient care, but also ordered services. And we also issue the framework for disease management programs, for example, in major diseases such as diabetes or coronary artery disease. Next, please. So why was CED, which is a coverage with evidence development, or what you call experimental coverage, is all the same. Why was this introduced in Germany? So basically, behind that was a political move back in 2012, when there was a national strategy process for medical devices, and which published its final report in 2012, and it was aimed at supporting, on the one hand, medical device manufacturers, especially small and medium-sized companies, in order to navigate the jungle of German regulation, but also to speed up the introduction of innovations into the healthcare system in Germany, which was also a reaction to slow decision-making processes within the GBA. As has been pointed out already, GBA relies on or applies evidence-based medicine, which means that we look for evidence, usually from evidence that stems from randomized controlled trials. And for many devices, such evidence was lacking at the time and still is lacking. And that's why many of the considerations took a very long time. And in addition, of course, we had weaknesses in the European regulation of medical devices. That it was necessary somehow to address this too in the German healthcare context, which turned out to enable GBA to initiate clinical trials in order to improve the evidence situation, or to close the evidence gap for many innovations. So next, please. So in 2012, the Belgian KCE, Belgian HTA organization, concluded on this situation that the evidence for medical devices is not comparable to the evidence that is available for drugs when they enter the market. And this report, of course, also contributed to the discussion in order to overhaul the medical device regulation system in Europe. And next one. And only 2 or 3 years ago, the so-called implant files initiative was published, which is a platform or database brought together by journalists from different journals in Europe, which try to document many issues with medical devices, and there were also major scandals going on at that time. For example, the famous metal hip prostheses, which were licensed despite lack of good evidence that they work, and etc. So this all led to initiatives on a national and European level. And as you all know, we now have a new European regulation, and the coverage with evidence development regulation in Germany is now in place. Next, please. So the law was enacted in 2012, and in 2013 officially the coverage with evidence development took off in Germany. So, and since then we have essentially three ways how the GBA deals with the assessment or evidence generation of medical procedures. So the first way or first trade is the so-called classical or conventional way, that is benefit assessment following an application by GBA stakeholders. In 2012, this was quite often the case with applications filed, for example, from patient representatives or from sickness funds, which addressed, for example, early detection of diseases, outpatient care, and hospital care. And many of those considerations ended nowhere, one has to say, because especially when it comes to hospital care, because of lack of evidence, and the CED regulation attempted to solve the situation as well. So this resulted in the next step, which was then introduced in 2013, which is benefit assessment following application by manufacturers, the so-called 137E rule. And this is for many manufacturers still an option to launch considerations by the GBA by filing an application. This is possible if it is a new device, and if the device is decisive within a medical procedure, a diagnostic or therapeutic. And it has to be somehow a commercial background, and the there is, and this will eventually lead to the issuing of a so-called testing directive or CED directive, which then leads to a clinical trial. If there is some sort of evidence that demonstrates that there is potential for an additional benefit for that one. And the third trade, which was introduced a few years ago, is the benefit assessment of high-risk medical device-related hospital methods according to 137H. And this relates to risk classes 2B and 3 device-related procedures, which are not which were not part of hospital care by 2015, and they also have to offer a so-called new theoretical scientific concept. So it has to be somehow entirely new. And this was very controversial at the beginning, and there were some changes in the law over the last couple of years. Anyway, all these three ways can lead to a clinical trial directive with three possible outcomes. There is a positive trial result. This would prove the additional benefit, and the trial would be the method would be included into the benefit package, or there's no benefit and it would be excluded. And we do not know yet what happens if the result is inconclusive, because there has not yet been any trial finished. They are all still running. Okay, next, please. So some of the principles behind these traits, or behind these three ways, are that GBA is obliged to initiate a clinical trial when the assessment process, regardless which way was followed, is or shows potential. So there are some preliminary initial data from early phase clinical trials that somehow include a comparison with a current standard. The regulation does not address specific products. So it could well be that several products are possible within one method. Think of ultrasound examinations also, or coronary stents, so that we do not issue medical device specific directives. Medical devices are associated with certain diagnostic or therapeutic procedures, which are in turn linked to a specific patient population and a specific indication. For the third way, the 137H, which is high-risk procedures in hospital care, which are new, they have to demonstrate their uniqueness in the form that they have to demonstrate how they differ from existing devices. It is also possible to ask for scientific advice by GBA. Next, please. So questions are possible, for example, related to the process of benefit assessment by GBA, questions regarding prerequisites of coverage decisions, questions regarding the trait according to 137E or 137H, and they are generally not legally binding, and they cost a fee. The fee can go up to 10,000 euros, depending on how much research has to be done in order to answer the questions of the manufacturer. Next, please. Our experiences so far are in total, I would say, positive. Frequent issues are is a certain procedure or device related to a procedure eligible for GBA assessment and for GBA initiated trials. That refers to the newness of the method. It is important to understand the concept of method, which is in general a device which is related to a certain diagnostic or therapeutic procedure, but not to the specific product. And it is important to understand when we talk about a procedure and when we talk about something a physician is doing without considering that as a procedure. For example, giving an injection would not be an injection, for example, intramuscular, which would not be considered as a therapeutic procedure. Questions also relate to the design of a trial, to the PICO question, based on preliminary data. For example, which one is the appropriate comparator, some ideas about the sample size, what would be patient-relevant endpoints. And we also can talk about already existing or planned trials and general ways to reimbursement, but not about pricing. This is not our mandate. Sometimes there are conflicting views between stakeholders of GBA, which means that no specific answer can be given to manufacturers, which is probably not always helpful to them. Next, please. Yeah, some numbers so far. So as I said, the whole 137 coverage with evidence development regulation started in 2013. So in the first row you see the number of applications for clinical trials that we received. So in every year there was a number of applications. In this year so far we received 6. And in the second row you see the number of scientific advices that we had. So this is a bit higher because many of these scientific advice procedures result in that manufacturers decide against filing an application with the GBA. They just have questions and then they are hopefully clarified. Then in 2016, the 137 age regulation started, which relates to high-risk hospital methods. And you can see that we also have a number of scientific advice procedures every year. They relate mainly to the question whether such a high-risk technology would be eligible in order to be filed with the GBA. If so, they have to submit a dossier to the GBA, and GBA decides whether a clinical trial is necessary or not. And as you can see here, the number of these submitted dossiers is quite varying. The reason for that is I would say a gap in the lawmaking process, because on the one side hospitals are obliged to submit a dossier if they consider that their treatment or diagnostic procedure together with a high-risk device is new, but on the other hand there is no consequence if they don't. And the next row you see the actual directives that have been issued since 2013. So in every year we have issued a number of directives. Each directive defines a clinical trial. And as you can see, in 2020, last year, we had a record number of 9 trials that have been described in a directive by GBA. And then you would suspect that these trials somehow also, these directives also translate into actual clinical trials that are performed. And as you can see, this is mostly not the case. And this is one of the reasons why the lawmaker changed some of the conditions of the CED regulation during the last years. One of the most important changes was that now GBA will pay for the total overhead costs. Until 2 years ago, only the manufacturer who filed the application had to pay for the overhead costs. So this was this caused a lot of problems, and many trials were not translated. On many directives did not come to clinical trials in practice, because funding was an issue. There were also other problems. For example, the devices were not longer on the market, etc. And so that's why the number of directives and the number of actually clinical trials that have started is somehow discrepant. And but since last year, we actually managed to start some of the trials. Right now, 6 are running and recruiting. One is in preparation, and currently we have 12 further trials that are in preparation. Whether they will actually translate into clinical trials remains to be seen. Next, please. Just for comparison, I just showed you how many scientific advice procedures we do for medical devices, and here's our activity for manufacturers of drugs for pharmaceuticals. And as you can see, there is a huge number of scientific advice procedures we manage every year. So you can see that GBA is mainly preoccupied with the arm lock, because this is also part of the arm lock regulation. Next, please. Yeah, you have seen this before. This is a list of clinical trials that are actually running. You can probably come back later on if you are interested in that. Next, please. Yeah, and this is my final slide, which should well, yeah, be seen as a sort of my personal experience with how GBA does with initiating clinical trials. So in general, this is a very slow-moving system. So if you are interested in getting a trial up and running in a very short time, you better not come to the GBA, because for certain reasons it needs some time. One of the reasons is that we commission, of course, the clinical trials to scientific institutions, and this requires a tender procedure, and this takes time and sometimes has to be repeated because there's a lack of interest, and we have to do it again. Also, we have to mandated by law, we have to do consultation and hearing processes, and several of them during the process of mandating a directive, and this takes a lot of time too. Then sometimes, as already said, products are no longer available on the market. If there is only one, then the study is not longer necessary, for example, or another trial is on the way and we didn't know that beforehand, or is already completed. So the question is it necessary to do the trial all over again? Quite often we have funding issues. So as I said, the overhead costs are covered by GBA. The company also can choose to cover the overhead costs, and usually the service provision of this procedure is paid by the sickness funds. But sometimes it is difficult to fix the reimbursement for the procedure within the trial. So this may cause delays in the start of the trial, and also it might prevent providers to take part as clinical trial centers within the study, because they feel that the reimbursement is not high enough, for example. On the other hand, sickness funds are, of course, reluctant in order to provide generous reimbursement for the procedure. And as we can see so far, is that the trials, which started mostly last year, have, with few exceptions, problems with recruitment. We are not sure yet whether this is because of the COVID-19 pandemic, or whether there are other reasons why that is the case. So one could also argue that doing international trials with centers in many countries would speed up the recruitment process. But so far, GBA has been reluctant to initiate clinical international trials. So all trials are now take place now in Germany or in German centers only. And of course, if the trial addresses a rare condition, it is of course more difficult to find enough recruiting centers and enough patients to go into the trial. Next, please. Yeah, that's not my slide.
Yes,
so that's
perfect. Thank you, Dr. Perleth. We're coming to the questions in a second, but just maybe as a kind of, let's say, conclusion, if I can say, I think experimental coverage generally could I think, be an evidence-driven market access pathway. But I think you, Dr. Perleth, has already pointed out a couple of, let's say, important hurdles as well. I think the pathway, I think, needs to be seen. I think there are different ones, as I have as well just alluded at the beginning of it. Inpatient, outpatient, within the outpatient, different ones. I think you have also mentioned different kind of, we call it milestones in terms of experimental coverage, which needs to be met. I think that's also due to the fact that obviously the GBA needs to, let's say, meet, align, and decide internally before then also the external, let's say, stakeholders like the industry could basically take part. And finally, obviously, it's also very important, and I think that might also, let's say, explain maybe some of the, I think you also called it issues, is the evidence-based medicine, let's say, component, right? Because you need to as well fulfill that. And sometimes you might also have, let's say, issues around that to bring it then really, let's say, up to speed. So having said that, I would hand over, Lutz, to you. I think it's time for questions.
Thank you, Stefan. Thank you, Dr. Perleth, for the wonderful presentation. Yes, we're coming now to the question section, and our lovely audience, please feel free to send more questions here. But we want to start here with one, which is a really example for how you could actually approach for that, and also said that I just want to point out that it's not information to give you a really legal answer on that question. But there's one audience member who actually were asked that he wants to ask about a product administered in the emergency room setting, which could prevent hospitalization, and how the reimbursement pathway is about that. And that's actually a really good examples like we had with other products when clients were coming, actually how to approach that, right? I mean, that's a product that could be everything. If we look at our lovely chart about the different reimbursement pathways. So that's actually one wonderful example. What are we doing there, right? Dr. Perleth and Stefan, how would you approach that, or give advice to that person?
So if I understood it correctly, I think it's about the product which is used in the emergency setting, right?
Yes, in the emergency room setting, I mean, you give there the product, and then it could actually prevent hospitalization.
I mean, how I would see it, and Dr. Perleth, please comment on that, but I think if it prevents hospitalization, it might be probably an outpatient case, right? Patient gets in, gets the product, and gets out of the hospital. I think for those, I would generally say, without knowing obviously the specifics, it's probably rather an outpatient kind of product. But for those, and that's maybe as well the kind of interesting question, for those patients who get the product, who do not, for example, respond to it and then stay in the hospital, I guess it needs to be, let's say, funded through the DRG system, right? Because then this patient is an inpatient. That is how I would see it. I don't know how you see that, Dr. Perleth.
Honestly, I have no idea, but I would suggest to ask for scientific advice at the GBA. Then we can look at the technology, and we can explain what would be possibility to deal with that. I would assume if it is administered in the emergency room, which belongs to a hospital, it would probably be considered as a hospital technology. But this is just a very preliminary judgment. So we would give some sort of legal advice. Also, we also involve our legal department, and if we can decide this case, we could probably do that. Otherwise, we could give non-binding advice. It might also be a possibility to to contact sickness funds first, because I think they probably also have an opinion on that.
That's also a really good point. I mean, that was my first thing, or my first impression when I saw that question is, what is it, right? Is it a drug? Then it could be like another pathway. Is it a medical device? How that is working, and then also like what we also had with you, Dr. Perleth, the question, how is it already reimbursed, right? Is it a new method, right? Is there already some coding? I mean, we were actually here all surprised by what the lawyers actually find out in the one or the other case. So we had a different gut feeling, but we're not the lawyers, and I think it's also taking the GBA some time actually to have a good solution, like what's actually the status of that. Yeah, that's actually the point. So that's what we also our advice. Please contact us, and then we show you like how the consulting is working. What you have to fill in. I mean, there's a formula on the GBA website, which is in German. And we had that comment that actually that one of our audiences actually, thank you for the valuable session in English. That is not because the GBA, as you have seen with Dr. Perleth, doesn't know the English language. No, it's just the official language by law is German, and that's why all the documentation and the applications are in German, right? And that's also like where we can actually offer you, we have some good friends here who are like simultaneous translators. So if you're like coming from another country, I mean, with that, we made that with Italian and Dutch translators, and also English to German. So, and we have then that consultation actually together, either virtual or face-to-face there, and that is also working. And that's the point is that you were actually asking your questions English, but the GBA, the Federal Joint Committee, they have to answer in German because it's the language.
That's
true. That's true. So that's the point. And we also have like a translation of that official formula. Yeah, that's a good point. Then next question is, how long does an experimental coverage process last on average? So what is your experience there, Dr. Perleth?
Well, count in years, I would say. The whole process is we get the application, then we have about, depending on whether it's the 137E or H path, between 8 weeks and 3 months time to decide initially whether it's eligible and whether it has enough data in order to proceed, which we call potential. But after that, it can take time, because then we start the consultation process on establishing a clinical trial. So the major cornerstones of a clinical trial, which is a patient population, define the intervention, define the comparator, define endpoints, and then when we have finished this one, this can take a pretty long time, because we have so many topics in parallel, especially since last year, that we have to prioritize. So sometimes this can take more than a year or so. Then we come up with a first proposal for a directive, which is then sent out for consultation, and then we have to collect all the answers to this consultation. We discuss them, then we change the directive, and then we again send it out for consultation. Then we have a hearing procedure probably, and then we discuss all the arguments again, and only after that we will finally issue the directive. So this can take 1 to 2 years, I would say, in total. It can go faster. Depends also on the workload, on how controversial is the topic, how difficult is the topic, and when the directive is finally published by GBA, then we start the tender process, which will also take a lot of time. So from initiating or from filing the application up to the start of the trial, it can take about 4 to 5 years.
Yeah, quite a long time. We have one question to that process. It's actually, are physicians or patient associations or physicians associations involved in the process? And if yes, how does the GBA take this into their consideration?
Yes, they are, and some steps are all involved. So mainly through consultation processes. So we ask medical societies which are relevant for a certain clinical trial, for the clinical area, for their opinion, of course. Also, the manufacturers are asked to provide input. Patient organizations provide input, and we do point-to-point consideration. So all arguments that are delivered to GBA are collated into huge tables. Sometimes this can be 100 pages if it is a lot of information and a lot of arguments, and then we do point-of-point consideration and consider whether this certain aspect needs to be taken into account, and eventually will change the directive. And and then we also document this, and this will finally also be published together with the directive.
Wonderful. Then we also have one question actually from our good friend Jamie from Canada. And he's asking about if there's like a different healthcare, well, if you have the normal medical devices and then versus a dental devices, which is actually relates to a robotic surgery. So I think there's probably a robotic, if I understand that right. It's a roboter who does like some dental surgery. Is there like a different for different needs for regulatory approval, trials, setting, or reimbursement setting? That when you have like the robotic for dental, that's a really specific question.
I think that's really specific. I would also say I think that's probably too much for the webinar. I think, Jamie, I think maybe just send us a quick email. I think that's probably, I mean, as Dr. Perleth said already, I think the example beforehand was already, let's say, quite tricky. But I think this one is probably even more tricky because it goes not only maybe a bit outside of what we have discussed today, right? I mean, it also goes a bit more, as you said, it's dental plus robotic. So I would say this is probably very specific. And I mean, I don't know, maybe Dr. Perleth, you might want to answer, but I think this is probably too generic to answer at this stage.
Yeah.
Well, what I can say is that a device has to have a CE marketing license. So this is one of the important conditions. So without CE mark, it is not possible to discuss this because it cannot be in healthcare anyway. So. And in Europe, of course, the rules until now were different to the rules in the US, for example, and this is changing now. So it would make sense to also ask for scientific advice if you are planning to get a CE mark in Europe. and look for reimbursement. Then to ask questions, what should you consider in doing a clinical trial? For example, which would be meaningful endpoints, which would be meaningful comparators to use. Otherwise, I would assume that this is a hospital technology, which is probably not used in outpatient settings. So it might also be interesting to ask whether this technology would be eligible to the 137H procedure. Mm-hmm. So is it something completely new, or is it just a variation of something that already exists? That would also be useful to know.
Yeah, very good points. Agree.
Okay. I have a small question about the things that are actually already done. So are there any results where you think there was like a good example that the experimental coverage system actually worked well, even it took a long time, if they're like already produced some results in a best practice, right, where it all went through? Is there already something available?
Unfortunately, not yet. All the trials are still running, and we do not have any results yet.
Okay, so let's just watch out when the first ones will get out, because I think this will also be a very interesting time.
Thank you. Well, thank you to our guest tonight, Dr. Mathias Perleth. That was really a wonderful presentation. Thank you very much for joining us tonight for this good coverage, and I think also from the feedback of our audience. Thank you, audience, for listening to us here tonight, and I hope you liked that session. It gives you a little bit more overview over the experimental coverage system here in Germany, and actually what to do actually when there's nothing available. And it could be actually a nice way, but it's a long way, right? But it really depending also when you have a good product, have potential there, right? I mean, that's also like stuff with if you don't have a really proof, but if you have potential, right, then you could come and then you could actually work with that, and also with the authorities. So the authorities always are not the bad, and they're not the ugly. So
yes, it might be just us.
That's actually that's a good point, right, to answer. So thank you very much, Dr. Mathias Perleth, actually. And you see, you can actually talk to the authorities and they give you an answer. And what I really liked about the Federal Joint Committee is that they give you an answer, and it's a reliable and understandable answer, right? So thank you very much actually there. Yeah. So yeah. And then actually we want to point out again to our Market Access podcast here, How to Fight Well, coming on November 1st, actually, with our good friend Bibiane. Should it also right in the AMNOG negotiations. That's also like a part where you just as a manufacturer can, and you have to understand the process so you can actually have a good decision for you, as always, the system, right? Because it's only like a win-win situation. Also understanding the system, understanding the needs of the system, also register for our next webinar, which is with our good friend, Dr. Matthias Flume, here about the KVs at the hidden watchdogs in Germany. Do not forget, it's not the last Thursday because of Thanksgiving. It's already on November 18th. So that said, coming to the end, thank you to Berlin, Dr. Mathias Perleth.
Thank you, Dr. Perleth.
Thank you, Stefan, here for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Lutz.
Have a good time.
Thank you. Have a good evening. Bye.
Bye-bye.